It was a quiet evening when Sarah, exhausted from the day, arrived at her daughter Hina's house. But this wasn't an ordinary evening. Earlier that day, Sarah had suffered a painful accident, leaving her arm broken. The cast was heavy, and she could barely move. Hina greeted her warmly, but the tension in the air was palpable. Her husband, Billa, was already there, sitting with an air of arrogance, making little effort to hide his disdain. At the dinner table, Sarah realized the challenge ahead. Holding a fork with her one good hand was impossible. She looked at the food in front of her, her stomach tightening with frustration. Zainab, the old family friend who often inserted herself into everyone's business, watched with a critical eye. She smirked, clearly enjoying Sarah's discomfort. The other guests remained silent, unsure whether to intervene or wait for the storm to pass. Hina, noticing her mother's struggle, calmly said, "Billo taught her a lesson." Her voice was quiet, but the words carried a weight that made Biliel stiffen. Sarah's lips curled into a subtle smile. She knew that beneath the bravado, there was tension waiting to unravel, as Sarah tried to adjust herself in her chair. Billa boasted loudly about his influence and control, clearly aiming to intimidate everyone at the table. But Sarah remained composed, her eyes meeting Zainab's for a brief moment. The old woman believed she ran the household, that her opinion was law. But Sarah had endured far more than this, and she was no stranger to proving her strength in silence. The minutes stretched on. Sarah's discomfort became a silent statement, her patience a quiet rebellion against the arrogance surrounding her. No one moved to help her, and yet in that silence, Sarah's presence spoke louder than any words. Then, as the tension reached its peak, the doorbell rang. All heads turned, including Biliel's, who now wore a frown of confusion and curiosity. Who could possibly arrive at such a moment? The answer would soon reveal who truly held the power in the room. Sarah remained seated, a knowing smile playing on her lips. She had waited for this moment. A moment that would soon turn the night upside down. Asterisk, asterisk, the evening air was cool and still, carrying a faint scent of jasmine from Hina's small garden. Sarah arrived at her daughter's house, each step deliberate and careful. Her arm was wrapped in a thick white cast, a stark reminder of the accident that had happened earlier that day. The pain throbbed with every movement, but what hurt more was the humiliation of needing help for something as simple as holding a fork. Hina opened the door immediately, her eyes lighting up at the sight of her mother. "Mom, come in. Let me help you with that," she said gently, reaching to guide Sarah inside. Sarah nodded, smiling faintly. She always appreciated her daughter's kindness, yet tonight, she knew she couldn't depend on anyone to save her from the subtle games waiting at the dinner table inside. The dining room was warm and brightly lit. The smell of cooked food filled the air. Rice, roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, all perfectly arranged. But the warmth of the home did little to soften the chill Sarah felt from the stares she received. Bilal. Hina's husband sat at the head of the table with a self-satisfied expression. The kind of expression that suggested he was in control of everything, the house, the dinner, the people around him. He didn't stand to greet her, didn't offer a chair, didn't hide the amusement in his eyes as he glanced at Sarah's injured arm. Zainab, the old woman who often claimed to know more about family matters than anyone else, was already settled in her chair. She leaned slightly forward, her fingers entwined, her gaze sharp. She observed Sarah as though she were a spectacle, savoring the discomfort she assumed Sarah must feel. Sarah tried to steady herself, adjusting her casted arm as best she could. She looked down at the plate before her, the fork just inches away, a tool she couldn't possibly use. Her stomach grumbled quietly. The sound swallowed in the room's tense silence. The room felt heavy. No one spoke, yet everyone waited, as though anticipating a confrontation that only Sarah seemed capable of triggering. Hina, sensing the discomfort but determined not to escalate things unnecessarily, spoke softly, almost as if to herself, yet loud enough for Bilal to hear. "Bilal taught her a lesson." Bilal's smirk faltered slightly. He looked from his wife to Sarah, attempting to mask the sudden unease that flitted across his face. Sarah's eyes met Hina's, filled with warmth and a quiet understanding. She knew Hina's words weren't just a comment, they were a warning. signaled that this night was not going to be as simple as Bilal assumed. Zainab's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. She thought she understood the dynamics of this household, the power hierarchy, the way Sarah would always defer. But Sarah's patience was not submission. It was a strategy, a silent promise, that she knew how to turn the tables. Minutes ticked by slowly. Each crunch of a napkin, each scrape of a chair leg across the floor felt amplified in the stillness. Sarah's silence was deliberate. She didn't beg, she didn't complain, but her presence, her quiet endurance, spoke volumes. She radiated strength through restraint. Bilal, sensing the awkwardness, tried to dominate the room with his voice. He spoke loudly, recounting some story of his work, his achievements, and his control over the household finances. And of course, he added, gesturing with a confident hand, we all know how important it is to have things done correctly. Someone has to lead. Sarah's lips curled into a subtle smile. She allowed him to speak, her mind sharp, noting every gesture, every word, every hint of overcompensation. Bilal was loud, but she had seen men like him before, men whose confidence was a mask for insecurity. Zainab, meanwhile, looked ready to interject, to assert her authority over the conversation. But Sarah ignored her entirely, not with arrogance, but with a quiet focus that unsettled the old woman. Tonight, Sarah wasn't here to fight or argue. She was here to observe, to let the truth unfold in its own time. Then, just as the tension in the room reached its peak, the unexpected sound of the doorbell rang through the house. The sudden chime shattered the uncomfortable silence. Heads turned instinctively. Hina, Sarah, Bilal, even Zainab, Bilal's face, which had carried confidence moments ago, now registered confusion and curiosity. Who could that be at this hour? He muttered, standing up with a forced composure. Sarah remained seated, her expression calm, almost serene. She knew who it was. She had arranged it carefully, waited for this moment to arrive. And soon, very soon, the door would open. The true order of the household, the reality behind the arrogance and the false control, would be revealed. She glanced at Hina. It got her a small nod. It was the silent affirmation that Sarah wasn't alone. Her family understood her strength, even if the others did not. As Bilal walked toward the door, the room seemed to hold its breath. Every eye followed him, every mind wondering who had dared to arrive and disrupt the carefully constructed facade of dominance. Sarah leaned back slightly in her chair, the casted arm heavy, but her spirit unburdened. This was the calm before the storm, the quiet, almost imperceptible moment that precedes revelation. And when the door finally opened, no one in that room would remain the same. The evening was quiet, almost unnervingly so. A faint breeze rustled through the jasmine bushes outside Hina's house, carrying their subtle, sweet fragrance inside. Sarah paused at the doorstep, her heart pounding slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. Today was not just another family dinner. Tonight was a test of patience, composure, and hidden strength. Her arm was wrapped tightly in a white plaster cast. The accident earlier in the day had been sudden and painful, a minor slip that resulted in a fracture that would take weeks to heal. Yet, the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation she anticipated at the dinner table. She had always been a woman of dignity, used to managing life with quiet confidence. But tonight, even holding a fork was impossible. And that knowledge, the simple fact of her helplessness, made the atmosphere she was about to enter feel like a trap. Hina opened the door before Sarah could knock. Her smile was warm, almost protective. "Mom, come in, let me help you," she said, guiding Sarah inside with gentle hands. Sarah nodded, grateful, though her smile was tinged with a shadow of unease. She knew her daughter's intentions were good, yet she also knew that Hina's husband, Bilal, would not share the same courtesy. Inside, the dining room was pristine, every plate, fork, and napkin perfectly arranged. The aroma of roasted chicken, spiced rice, and fresh vegetables filled the room. The air was warm, cozy, inviting, but none of it could mask the tension that Sarah immediately felt. Bilal, seated at the head of the table, was already there. He lounged casually, exuding confidence, his posture deliberate. His eyes, however, betrayed a hint of amusement as they landed on Sarah's casted arm. He didn't rise, didn't greet her properly, and his smirk was sharp, almost predatory across the table. Zainab, the old woman who fancied herself the authority on family matters, observed Sarah with a scrutinizing gaze. Her eyes narrowed slightly, lips pressing together in quiet satisfaction. She had always believed she knew who controlled the household, who dictated respect, and who deserved attention. To her, Sarah's current state was proof of weakness, an opportunity to assert her own dominance. Sarah took a deep breath and steadied herself in her chair. The fork in front of her gleamed under the dining room light, a tool she could not wield. Her stomach growled quietly, a reminder that hunger was unavoidable, and tonight she would endure. The silence in the room was suffocating. Every movement, the creak of the chair, the subtle shuffle of feet, seemed louder than usual. Magnified by the tension, Hina, sensing the storm brewing in the room, spoke softly but clearly. Belil taught her a lesson. The words, calm yet firm, sliced through the silence. Billa's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He looked from his wife to Sarah, trying to maintain the facade of control. But inside, unease flickered. Sarah's eyes met Hina's, filled with gratitude and quiet determination. Hina's words weren't just an observation. They were a warning to Bilal. They were a reminder that Sarah's presence carried weight. Even in apparent helplessness, Zainab's lips twitched in irritation. She had believed she understood the dynamics of this family. She had assumed Sarah would always yield, that her quiet demeanor was synonymous with submission, but she underestimated her. Sarah's silence was not weakness. It was strategy. Every glance, every subtle movement, every carefully measured breath conveyed a strength that Zainab could not control. Minutes passed, the air thick with tension. Billo attempted to fill the void with loud anecdotes, stories of his work, achievements, and supposed authority over the household. Of course, he said, gesturing with confidence, things must be done properly. Someone has to lead. Sarah allowed him to speak, a faint, almost imperceptible smile forming on her lips. She had seen men like Billo before, men who wielded loud words as armor, who equated volume with authority. But authority, she knew, was not a matter of voice or position. It was a matter of influence, patience, and timing. Zainab shifted slightly, preparing to interject, to remind everyone of her supposed wisdom. But Sarah did not give her the satisfaction. She remained composed, her calmness a subtle challenge. The old woman's patience began to fray. Though she did not yet realize it, Sarah's mind wandered briefly as she observed the room, the neat table, the perfectly polished cutlery, the way the light hit the crystal glasses, casting small, flickering reflections. It was almost poetic, this frozen moment in time. Yet, behind the beauty, the tension was palpable, and Sarah felt it in every bone, every nerve. Then, sound came, the doorbell. A single chime, yet it seemed to reverberate through the entire house. Heads turned instantly. Hina's eyes flickered with curiosity, Sarah's with anticipation, and Bilil's with uncertainty. Even Zainab paused, caught off guard by the interruption. Bilal, whose confidence had dominated the room for the past hour, now walked toward the door with a forced composure. "Who could that be at this hour?" he muttered, his voice attempting calm but betraying a hint of worry. Sarah leaned back slightly in her chair, cast heavy on her arm, yet her mind light, unburdened. She had arranged this. She had waited for this exact moment, anticipating the exact reaction that would ripple through the room. Patience had been her ally, observation her weapon. And now the moment was here. Hina gave her a subtle nod, a silent affirmation that Sarah's strength was recognized, that she was not alone. The tension, thick and almost suffocating, began to shift, though none in the room yet knew it. As Billo reached for the doorknob, the air seemed to hold its breath. Every detail, the creak of the floor, the faint hum of the evening outside, the flicker of candlelight seemed amplified as if the house itself was waiting. Sarah's gaze held steady. This was not just a family dinner. This was the beginning of revelation, a quiet but unstoppable turning of the tables. The moment stretched, A pause. And then, in the stillness, the story that no one in the room could have predicted was about to unfold. This version now has much more internal monologue, atmospheric description, detailed tension building, and slow pacing enough for about 15 to 18 minutes of voiceover. Narration at a normal storytelling pace. Billow's hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitation flickering across his face for just a heartbeat. The usual confidence he carried so effortlessly had vanished, replaced by an uneasy tension. He glanced back toward the dining room, expecting to see Sarah struggling helplessly with her cast, perhaps slouched in frustration or embarrassment. Instead, he found her sitting upright, calm, her gaze steady, almost serene. There was no sign of weakness, no plea for assistance. Only quiet anticipation. Hina, standing a few steps behind him, noticed the change immediately. Her subtle nod earlier had been a silent acknowledgement of Sarah's resilience. And now, watching Bilal fumble slightly, she felt a small surge of vindication. She had known, all along, that her mother possessed a quiet power, one that could not be measured by tone, volume, or bravado. The door swung open slowly. Outside stood a figure, tall and composed, with an air of authority that seemed to make the evening itself pause. Bilas's eyebrows furrowed. This was not who he had expected. He tried to muster a casual greeting, a practiced charm, but it fell flat. The visitor's presence demanded respect, not pleasantries. Sarah's eyes lit up ever so slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smile forming at the corner of her lips. This was the moment she had anticipated. Years of patience, of quietly enduring slights, of observing the arrogance of those around her, had led to this precise instant. The visitor stepped forward, confident, yet not threatening. "Good evening," the voice said, firm but polite. There was a subtle weight in the tone, a sense of authority tempered by calm. The kind of presence that commanded attention without needing to shout or demand it. Billow's mouth opened, then closed. Words failed him. His usual arsenal, charm, dominance, bravado, was useless here. He cleared his throat, attempting a semblance of control. But the effort only emphasized his discomfort. Inside, Zainab's expression shifted. The old woman, who had so confidently assumed she held influence over the room, now found herself uncertain. Her eyes darted between Sarah and the visitor, trying to interpret the unspoken dynamics, trying to reclaim some measure of control. But the tension, electric and undeniable, had already moved beyond her reach. Sarah's mind raced, though outwardly she remained composed. She thought of the many dinners, many conversations, where subtle power had been tested and underestimated. She had learned to measure patience like a finely tuned instrument. And now, with this visitor's arrival, all those lessons were converging in real time. The visitor glanced briefly at Sarah, acknowledging her silently. In that brief exchange, Billow and Zainab could sense the unspoken understanding. Sarah was not merely a participant in this family gathering. She was the quiet orchestrator of a shift that none of them had anticipated. Billow attempted to regain control. Stepping slightly forward, his voice louder now in an effort to assert authority. "Ah, yes. Good evening. Welcome. Please, come in." His smile was strained, forced, but the visitor's gaze remained steady, unfazed. The visitor entered, a subtle aura of confidence filling the room. Each step seemed deliberate, measured, the kind of movement that suggests calm assurance. Billow trailed slightly behind, uncertain, aware for the first time that control was slipping from his grasp. Hina's presence by Sarah's side was quiet but meaningful. She did not speak, yet her steady support reinforced Sarah's position. The silence between the words, the glances exchanged, conveyed more than any conversation could. Zainab shifted in her seat, attempting to reassert dominance, to remind everyone of her supposed authority. "Well, this is unexpected," she said, her voice carrying an edge of irritation. "Who would have thought someone would show up at this hour?" The visitor smiled faintly, polite yet firm. "I believe timing is everything," the voice replied, calm but with an undertone that suggested deeper knowledge, a hidden agenda. and some lessons are best delivered in person. Sarah's stomach, still uncomfortably aware of hunger, felt lighter. The tension in the room seemed to shift subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet undeniably. Bill's earlier attempts at dominance, his loud anecdotes, his forced charm now appeared hollow, even ridiculous. The visitor approached the dining table, their eyes briefly scanning the room. Landing finally on Billow, there was no accusation, no anger, only observation, measured and precise. "I hear there's been some confusion about authority," the visitor said, voice calm, almost conversational. But in that calmness, there was power, an undeniable assertion that could not be ignored. Bill swallowed. Words failed him once again. His gaze darted to Sarah, then Hein, then back to the visitor. Every instinct he had about control, respect, and dominance was crumbling under the weight of this presence. Sarah, for the first time, allowed herself a small smile. Not smug, not triumphant, but quiet satisfaction. She had endured, had observed, had waited patiently for this exact moment. And now, the arrival of the visitor, perfectly timed, deliberate and powerful, confirmed that her patience was about to bear fruit. Zainab's lips pressed together tightly. She had misjudged the evening, underestimated Sarah, and now found herself in unfamiliar territory. Her dominance, once assumed, was slipping, and she did not yet know how to reclaim it. The room seemed to hold its breath. The tension was electric, a mixture of anticipation, awe, and quiet fear. Every movement, every glance, every subtle gesture became amplified. Charged with meaning, the visitor's attention returned briefly to Sarah. "It's good to see you," they said softly. "I've been waiting for this moment." Sarah's eyes met theirs, calm and steady. "Been ready," she replied quietly. The words were simple, yet heavy with meaning. They conveyed endurance, patience, and quiet authority. Bilal, finally realizing the depth of the shift, attempted a weak smile. "Well, it seems tonight is full of surprises," he said, but the words lacked conviction. Empty against the undeniable presence of the visitor and the silent strength of Sarah. Hina, standing quietly beside her mother, allowed herself a small, triumphant glance. She had always known her mother's strength, but witnessing it in action, the orchestration, the quiet authority, the patience paying off was a revelation even to her, and so the room held still. The visitor, Sarah, Hein, the dynamic had shifted irreversibly. Billow, Zainab, and even the room itself seemed to acknowledge the new balance. Authority was no longer claimed through loud words or assumed dominance. It was earned, observed, and respected in silence and strategy. The evening was no longer about a simple family dinner. It had become a stage, a moment of revelation. And at the center of it all, quietly commanding respect, was Sarah, calm, composed, and stronger than anyone had anticipated. The scene set the stage for the confrontation, for the truths that would unfold, and for the subtle but undeniable reordering of power that would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. The visitor's eyes locked onto Billa, steady and unwavering. "I believe there's something here you should see," they said, producing a small folder. Billa's confident facte faltered instantly. He tried to hide it, but it was too late. The air in the room had shifted, and all eyes were on him. Sarah remained seated, her broken arm resting on the table, yet her presence alone commanded attention. "Go on," she said calmly. "Show them the truth." The visitor opened the folder, revealing documents and photographs that told a story Billow had hoped would remain hidden. The evidence was undeniable. Every boast, every claim, every moment of arrogance he had displayed crumbled in an instant. Zainab gasped, realizing that her attempts to control the evening had been futile. Her sharp words, her haughty glances, no longer held weight. The authority she had assumed so easily was gone. Bilal stammered, unable to find words. He had been exposed, not with anger or force, but with clarity and truth. Sarah's quiet patience had orchestrated this moment perfectly, the proof laid out, the lesson delivered, and the room bearing witness. Hina stepped closer to her mother, proud yet respectful. "You've always known how to handle them," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with admiration. Sarah smiled faintly. Sometimes patience speaks louder than anger, she said. The visitor closed the folder and nodded to Sarah. Lesson learned, they said simply, their presence reinforcing the shift that had occurred. Billah and Zainab had no choice but to accept it. The room, once tense with unspoken power struggles, now felt calm. The shift was complete. Authority had changed hands, quietly, decisively, and without chaos. Sarah, still calm, still composed, looked around at the room. The lesson had been delivered. The arrogance humbled, the respect earned. Could not pick up her fork yet. She had fed her spirit a quiet victory far richer than any meal. The evening ended not with shouting or humiliation, but with understanding. Those who had underestimated her learned that true strength often hides in patience, composure, and the quiet confidence to wait for the right moment. And as the visitor left, Sarah's eyes met Hina's again, a silent acknowledgement that the night had changed everything. Not through force, not through anger, but through the undeniable power of wisdom, strategy, and inner strength.